He mihi nunui kia koutou, ko mga kia te maunga, ko waitamata te moana, ko mahuhu o te rangi te waka, ko Ngāti Whātua te iwi, ko Michelle Thompson-Fawcett tōku whenua, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nawe Odena, Nawe Odena, that means centre of the heart and community in Anishinaabe language. 1 month ago, exactly, a stunning and really innovative master plan was released for a substantial urban development, including residential, commercial, recreational, sport and community activities, all created by an Indigenous Treaty 1 set of First Nations. This was done in the centre of Winnipeg in Canada. The Anishinaabe culture and language are both being celebrated in that new name of the former Kapyong Barracks, a military site in Winnipeg, Nawe Odena. So a group of 7 Treaty 1 First Nations own and are developing 2/3 of the 65-hectare site. And they're developing it as an urban reserve within the inner city periphery of metropolitan Winnipeg. The site was abandoned by the infantry in 2004. The Canadian forces declared it surplus at that time. The Federal Treasury Board planned to sell the land to a Crown corporation. That decision to sell to a corporation was challenged in court by the Treaty 1 First Nations, who managed to successfully argue that their outstanding treaty land entitlement claims meant they had a right to that site. Sound familiar? Thus, the land transfer to the Crown Corporation was ruled illegitimate. Nevertheless, the federal government appealed the decision. So we're starting back in 2004, and finally in 2015, it was announced that the government would no longer pursue their appeal. So finally, in 2019, the land transfer to Treaty 1 First Nations was made official. That's a good start. But once such lands are acquired, there's a process of formally adding them to the First Nations reserve lands. When that is complete, the lands are actually removed from the municipal area in a technical sense and are no longer an area over which the municipality has any authority. So the local authority planning policies and zoning do not apply, even though the land might be right in the middle of the city, as it is in this particular case. Such urban lands are often quite a distance away from the main reserves of the Indigenous communities concerned, and most First Nations will therefore actually need to purchase services such as water reticulation and sewerage from the municipality, who's just relinquished their land. However, in my research with Janice Barry, we show that government-to-government aspects of this municipal Indigenous planning relationship have not always been understood and certainly not respected. Commonly, municipal services will not be provided in such circumstances unless the Indigenous development on the new urban reserve is in accordance with the municipality's existing zoning requirements. Such provisions fail to respect Indigenous jurisdictional authority. They effectively cast the Indigenous group's place in the governance of urban property to one that is akin to that of any other property developer. That is a stakeholder, as opposed to a partner government. Now, while the jurisdictional arrangements in Manitoba are different to those we have here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the experiences in both locations deliver the same message. Local government unpreparedness to build proactively on treaty settlements and on expectations of partnership in government-to-government relations between Indigenous authorities and local authorities. So lands intended to support cultural, political and economic redress are entwined within planning systems, settler-colonial planning systems, that struggle to relinquish control over land use making and have couched this struggle in a concern for the integrity of existing neighbourhoods and the primacy of it upholding existing planning provisions when attempting to embrace the public interest, whatever that might be. So local government has been positioned in this way as the rightful planner in this situation, while Indigenous governments have been conceived as the object of planning attention. So this is the space in which I base my research. So I'm a geographer and a planner. split personality. These are personally challenging disciplines in which to be based. On the one hand, the European geographical societies from which geography is drawn were deeply embedded in European imperialism, and the discipline continues to be highly compromised by that ancestry and its ongoing practices of subordination and exclusion. On the other hand, the planning profession has been a prime instigator of dispossession within the colonial project and remains inhospitable to Indigenous expressions of sovereignty. But they're both also disciplines at the forefront of issues around spatial justice and spatial injustice, and that's where I move and interlace with them in terms of drawing the disciplines into a new direction. So my efforts in the Academy and with Indigenous communities prioritise uncovering the nuances of place in the maintenance of identity, revealing the power relations evident in the practices surrounding the planning of space, and then envisioning transformation that will facilitate aspirations of decolonisation, indigenisation, and self-determination. Although dominant colonial practices reproduce Western ways of being and planning systems, in recent decades there has been a concerted resurgence of resistance through the application of Indigenous knowledges and praxis. It should actually come as no surprise that Indigenous peoples have had their own planning ethos, planning practices, planning systems, institutions related to planning processes for centuries. Indigenous planning is that which is conducted by and with, not for, Indigenous communities, using their own planning experts, employing their own procedures, and achieving outcomes that they define themselves. This form of planning is grounded in specific localities, sure, but its scope is really broad and is values-led, and it's not limited to the sort of spatial planning or resource management of the settler-colonial regime within which they have to operate. In general, the extent of Indigenous traction in settler-colonial urban planning, which is my particular speciality, is stunningly revealed in the ongoing relative invisibility of Indigenous histories and values in our built environment. However, conventional planning systems are now being disrupted, thank goodness, by ingenious and reinvigorated Indigenous endeavour, and this is the focus of my work. So let me mention just one optimistic example, that of Ōtautahi Christchurch. This is a post-disaster setting, and internationally it's evident in the research that we've done that post-disaster urban planning extends and actually perpetuates political exclusion through the new decision-making structures that they set up that fail to accommodate and account for marginalised entities. So it's not a good start. The institutional framework established in recovery planning by and large does not exhibit any efforts to avoid political exclusion, as that would inhibit the prompt decision-making and efficient recovery. However, historically, Ngāi Tahu's involvement in urban planning in Ōtautahi Christchurch has been hindered by a legacy of ignorance towards their counter-colonial interests, though recently this ignorance has been incrementally destabilised through political decentralisation, the introduction of the mixed member proportional representation, post-treaty settlement expectations, and of course reforms in resource management. However, even more important, since the earthquakes, there has been a heightened period of a multiplicity of forms of Ngāi Tahu leadership in urban planning. The Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Act required the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, SERA, to work with Ngāi Tahu in its development of their recovery strategy. And in addition, SERA also mobilised a program for enabling community engagement. This offered an opportunity for Māori communities to participate in planning as part of the wider Canterbury community, in addition to Ngāi Tahu playing a governance role via the SERA provisions. Hence, Ngāi Tahu had a formal place on all the government-derived layers of decision-making activities related to rebuilding the city, and furthermore also utilised a series of Ngāi Tahu tribal and sub-tribal bodies that specifically participated in areas of recovery relating to their particular areas of expertise. So for Ngāi Tahu and the government, engagement in recovery in Ōtautahi has represented a really progressive step towards, but not all the way there, realising Indigenous claims to rangatiratanga. Planning in Canterbury has become not only more empowering for Ngāi Tahu, but far exceeds the progress that we would normally see and in the examples of work that we've done elsewhere in the hurried process of disaster recovery. So it's this attempt at rebuilding Ōtautahi that's represented in what's on our screen here at the moment in the painting. So this is based on a real photo, not the kitty, I guess. It's based on a real photo of Ōtautahi using a zoom lens looking from east to west. That's why the mountains look so close. So the depiction is of multifaceted influence by Ngāi Tahu, as you can see in the many kites and the various different groups with different interests that Ngāi Tahu brought into the whole process of reconceiving of how Ōtautahi might develop in the future, and thus sculpting a renegotiated urban environment for the city, and a renegotiated environment that interweaves and establishes coexistence of different peoples in a kind of partnership. So by way of conclusion, these achievements are somewhat ad hoc, and they're not part of a coherent or deliberate or even wide-ranging strategy for urban planning transformation. However, they do provide an important point of departure in ongoing enterprise towards the decolonisation and indigenisation of planning and the search for just planning partnerships between Indigenous peoples and settler-colonial governments. Nō reira, I'd just like to say a big thank you in particular to the many Indigenous colleagues and Indigenous communities and whānau and Mark, Daisy and Jed's here. Daisy's not here, she's represented in the painting today, she's attending lectures at Otago. So big thank you to all those who have had a key role in leading me and supporting me on this journey so far. Ka nui tēnei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.